budget negotiations are developing in this legislature. For those of you online, you'll hear that this webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards on both the NAM and the OpenSky websites. I want to say thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We know that it's a holiday. The legislature is not in session today, so this is actually a good day for those of us who follow the legislature to take a breath and take stock of what's happening in the legislature, particularly as it comes to the budget. So I am going to share screen and get us up and running with some visuals that we've got ready today. So bear with us. And all right, here we go. So we're going to be, Craig and I are going to be having a conversation with you about what we're seeing in the governor's budget proposal and in a preliminary budget recommendation that's come from the Appropriations Committee, giving you a little bit more context about what the state of affairs. We will appreciate audience participation during this webinar, so please put your questions into the Q&A box, and once Craig and I get through with some of the material that we prepared for you today, we will make sure that we are answering your questions. And now, Craig, let's get started. So we're in a budget year, and at OpenSky Policy Institute, a key focus for us as a fiscal policy organization is to think about how to make the budget accessible to all Nebraskans. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the budget process and sort of what that means for folks who don't follow the legislature so closely. So in a budget year, give us a quick refresh on the budget process.
Sure. So if you could advance the slide, please. Thank you. So we are in an odd year in the legislature, which means that the legislature is hard at work formulating the budget for the next biennium or the next 2-year period on which the state runs its finances. So this is a nifty little timeline that OpenSky has and utilizes quite a bit during the budget years. So we are well into the timeline here. It looks like we're already into February, which is quite shocking. But so there's been a lot that's happened already in the budget process. So agencies have already submitted all their budget requests. The governor has reviewed them. The governor has submitted his budget proposal to the full legislature. The budget bills were actually heard in hearing last week in the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee has also released their preliminary budget already a bit early this year. Typically, they wouldn't have to release it until about March 15th, but they decided to get their preliminary proposal out there early this year. So what will be taking place in the coming weeks is the Appropriations Committee will be holding hearings for each agency. Those began last week. As I said, they'll continue for the next few weeks. And then once those committees, once each agency gets a committee hearing, the Appropriations Committee itself will formulate their final budget proposal and make their final recommendations to the legislature. That will have to be out on the floor by May 2nd. And then the body will have until the end of the session to pass the budget. So.
All right, that sounds good. Thanks for walking us through that process, Craig. So you mentioned the governor's budget proposal. To start us off, can you talk us through some of the top lines on that proposal?
Yes, absolutely. If you could please advance the slide. So I think there are a few overarching themes that we can take from the governor's budget proposal. The first being that the governor proposes relatively low spending growth for state government in a period of relatively high inflation, particularly when we look back over the last 15, 20 years, certainly. His budget proposal also builds in significant tax cuts on top of what were already fairly significant tax cuts passed by the body last year. The governor also dedicates quite a bit of our current finances to K through 12 public education. I will note that there are some strings attached with that funding that we will talk about here in a little bit as we dive deeper into the budget. And the final point I think that's important to make about the governor's proposal is that his proposal doesn't leave a ton of money on the floor of the legislature for other proposals outside of his budget. And we'll definitely dive into that here in a bit as well. And I would note that, the governor's budget is just a proposal. The Appropriations Committee will ultimately have say in what's included in their budget proposal that goes to the floor. And then, of course, the full legislature will determine whether to accept the committee's recommendations or to amend the budget on the floor. So.
All right. So you talked when you were going through the budget process, Craig, about how a recent development is the recent release of the Appropriations Committee preliminary budget. So can you talk through some top lines for that proposal?
Absolutely.
And I'm going to move us along.
Thank you. So the Appropriations Committee, as I mentioned, dropped their preliminary budget report about a month ahead of when they were actually required to release it. So I would say that because it was released prior to each of those agency hearings, there's still quite a few questions that are left unanswered as to what exactly the committee is going to fund at this time or propose to fund at this time. As I mentioned, those agency hearings have only just begun, and once those hearings take place and the committee releases their final proposal, we'll have a much better idea as to what they're thinking. One thing I would note that I think is pretty important with the committee proposal is that it does have higher state government spending growth than the governor's proposal does. It's still low relative to inflation, but it's certainly higher than what the governor has proposed. And at this point, at least, the committee proposal leaves more money for the floor of the legislature, which would mean that there's more money for those priorities outside of the budget that have been introduced by other various senators. I will note, though, that money that is left for the floor is a preliminary amount. We will have to see ultimately what the committee includes in their final proposal to see exactly how much money they leave on the floor.
Okay. So I think maybe it's a good idea to step back for a moment. We've seen the governor's as a budget proposal out there. The Appropriations Committee has their preliminary recommendations. There's some alignment and some significant divergence between the two. But give us a quick refresh on our current finances coming into this particular legislative session.
Sure. So we had done a webinar at the beginning of session where we dove into this topic pretty deeply. And some highlights of that, we came into this session with what are record finances for the state. We came in with a record general fund surplus nearing $2 billion. In context of our total biennial budget, that's roughly 20% that we came in with excess, effectively cash on hand, though they are projected, it is projections at this point. We're also sitting at a point where we have a very robust cash reserve or state savings account. Right now, Nebraska's finances are really propped up by the federal stimulus that we received during the pandemic. You'll hear us say this a lot, but it is really a driving factor of our state's current finances. We got roughly $24 billion in federal money that came into the state in a very short period of time. I think it's really important to keep in mind when we talk about the state's finances right now that we are relying on revenue projections for the upcoming biennium, which is again the period of time that the state legislature is currently working on a budget for. One important thing that is coming up in the budget process and is actually happening this coming Friday is a meeting of the Nebraska Forecasting Board. And the forecasting board serves the function of setting the state's revenue projections for future years. And it is those revenue projections that the legislature is able to base how much money they can spend in the upcoming budget cycle on. So this meeting coming up on Friday is a really important piece of the budget process, and we look forward to seeing what information we glean from that meeting come Friday.
Okay, thanks, Fred. I'm sorry, Fred. I'm thinking about some media journalists. I'm sorry, Craig. So forecasting board, it's on Friday. And this is the group that says like how much revenue or dollars are potentially coming into the state over the next few years that the legislature would have available to spend. But tell us a little bit about like what is this forecasting board? Who are they? How does this forecasting board come about?
Sure. So you are absolutely right that the forecasting board plays an integral role in the budget process. It is a committee of folks from around the state who are well versed in economics and business. Half of the body is appointed by the governor, half is appointed by the legislature. They meet 3 times per year in an odd year, twice a year in even years. And what their core function is to really look at the economic data for Nebraska, what big economic firms are forecasting for the state in terms of our economic growth, our employment, personal consumption, all those economic factors that really inform how much revenue we expect to collect. And then from those, from all of those data points, the board forecasts how much revenue they believe that the state will collect in order, again, to form the basis of the 2-year budget cycle that we're working on.
Okay, so these are the folks people who are skilled in economics and finance, coming together to look at a bunch of different economic information for the state, and in order to figure out how much sort of tax dollars we think the state of Nebraska is going to be collecting to figure out how the legislature can set a budget to spend it.
Yes.
So there's a lot of talk right now in the media. There's like economic uncertainty about the effects of inflation, what the Federal Reserve might be doing with inflation rates, what's going to happen on a federal level with the debt ceiling. I know that we can't speculate, but about what's going to happen in this meeting, but safe to say, right, that these folks are going to be looking at all of that uncertainty and trying to figure out some recommendations or for a path forward for what the state of Nebraska can expect is going to happen over the next couple of years.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. So that's a lot of information for them to have to synthesize in order to put together some recommendations.
Yes, it certainly is.
Yeah. Okay. One more question before we sort of move on to the next topic of conversation, but we were talking about how Nebraska got into this position where we have a $1.9 billion surplus. And you were talking about how it's related to how much fiscal stimulus was happening from the federal level. So would you say Nebraska is sort of unique in that situation of having this kind of budget surplus?
That's an excellent question. No, Nebraska is not unique. Many other states are experiencing record, or certainly close to record, budget surpluses at the moment. Again, the underlying consensus as to why that is happening largely due to all of the federal stimulus that has flown as a result of the pandemic, but is ultimately waning and is coming to a close. So we will just have to wait and see how that affects our finances moving forward.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. But what comes up presumably at some point must come down. So, all right. So you mentioned spending growth as a top line in both proposals. Can you kind of just walk us through that?
Sure. So general fund spending, and when I say general fund, think of it as kind of the state's main checking account that we fund, the bulk of our services from, like healthcare and education. So general fund spending in the governor's proposal is held at 1.3% over the next 2 years. And with our period of high inflation, inflation was 6.4% last month over the prior January. We're concerned that 1.3% isn't really enough to sustain state services. As I mentioned, the committee's preliminary budget does have a bit higher spending growth proposed, and their rate is at 2.7%, so roughly double what the governor is proposing over the next 2 years. That 2.7% that the committee is proposing is still lower than inflation, but it's certainly higher than the governor's proposal.
Okay. So the governor has also announced some big priorities, like $1 billion investment in K-12 funding and some major tax cuts. So how can spend growth be so low if those items are also in the budget?
Sure. And if you could advance to the next slide, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this is a really good question. As I mentioned, general fund spending in both budget proposals is held pretty low, but as you just said, we're seeing some very big ticket items being proposed in the budget. So I think the simplest answer is that these big ticket items that we're talking about, things like the K-12 funding proposal, as well as things like additional property tax credits that are being proposed, are technically not general fund spending. I would say it's sort of a budget loophole in the best sense of the word, nothing nefarious, but these big ticket items function like spending, as they certainly reduce the amount of general fund dollars that we have available for our services, but those big ticket items, because of the way they are classified within the budget, technically and ultimately do not count toward that general fund spending number.
Okay. So the governor and the appropriations committee are proposing to spend money. It just isn't included in this general fund spending growth rate sort of baseline, right?
Correct. And
Okay.
those bigger ticket items, instead of general fund spending, they're classified as what we call transfers. It's just really a technical term, that the money is transferred out of the general fund before the general fund is utilized for other services. So if you include things like the K-12 funding proposal that the governor is including, as well as the increases in the property tax credits that he is proposing as well, along with the general fund spending that is currently being proposed by the governor and the committee, you're looking at, realistically a general fund spend of somewhere around 20%, perhaps a little bit more. But again, when we look at general fund spending just in context of services that we spend money on, those numbers are quite a bit lower. Okay.
All right. And technically speaking, those transfers out are in a different piece of legislation than the general fund spending. It's just when you put the full piece of like the entire budget package together, which goes across a number of different bills, the total amount of spending gets closer to being like 20% rather than
Sure.
1.3
Yes.
or 2.7. So
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's talk about these big ticket items. So what's tell us a little bit more about what the governor's proposing for K through 12 education. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about it in the news, but let's drill into it a bit.
Sure. So the governor is proposing to give K-12 public education $1.25 billion over the next budget cycle, and then also proposing to give an additional $250 million each year thereafter. This fund is called the Education Future Fund, which you may hear people talk about. But what this fund would do is it would fund foundation aid for all public school students, and it would increase the state's reimbursement for special education. It is definitely a big investment. There's no question about that. But one thing I would caution is that there are seemingly, if the package is going to go, there are seemingly some strings attached, including a cap on school revenue growth. And, our wonderful education policy director, Connie Kanoki, has spent a lot of time analyzing these proposals. And what she has found is that even with this, pretty large proposed investment, this proposed cap that's going along with it could really tie the hands of schools as we move forward. And I would also note, just very briefly, that this proposal is included in the committee's preliminary budget.
So let's make sure we're specific about that. Sort of which part of the proposal is actually included in the preliminary budget?
Sure, that's a great question. So the funding for the proposal, which there are two bills, there's a funding component, and then there's the actual mechanism, that goes in and changes the education formula and the law. The committee budget includes the funding piece. So of course the additional bill would have to move forward as well if it were to become law.
Okay, so the revenue caps, that's not something that would end up being in the budget, but what the budget has is the $1.25 billion investment in K through 12.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, all right. So tax cuts are also part of the governor's priorities. So why don't you talk us through those in some more detail?
Sure. So if you could advance the slide, please.
Sure.
So, yes, absolutely. The governor is proposing that we enact additional tax cuts this year, which again, we did last year as well. The governor is proposing that we drop both personal and business income tax rates, but only at the top of the income distribution. And the new rates that the governor is looking for are quite a bit lower than what was agreed to last year. So we have mentioned that these tax cuts will cost money, and they certainly do. For the upcoming biennium, the governor's budget proposal says that these cuts to the business and personal income tax will cost about $340 million. But it is really important to look at this proposal in the context of the whole proposal, right? So these proposals phase in over time. So they phase in these significant reductions to the top income tax rates over time. So by the time they are fully phased in, we estimate that they will cost the state about $1.3 billion each year. And just to put that in context really quick, that is about a quarter of our current budget. These tax cuts are not included in the committee preliminary budget yet. But I say yet because the committee did leave a line item in the budget, just blank as of right now, but for revenue reducing proposals. So we fully expect that the committee will, make room for these proposals as they continue to formulate their final budget proposal.
Okay, so that's a lot of money. Talk us through what these cuts are and who would actually see a tax cut.
Sure. So this slide that we've got here shows the personal income tax cut proposal that the governor is currently proposing. And because it targets just the top rates of our income tax code, will necessarily predominantly flow to high and higher income folks. So again, here's the distribution for personal income tax cut. So I think what's perhaps important to point out here is that at the bottom there, we've got the top 1%. The top 1% of Nebraskans under this tax cut proposal, we estimate would receive an average benefit of about $32,500 per year, while the bottom 20%, which is up at the top of that graph, would receive about $5 on average per year. Just to give you some context, the top 20% of Nebraskans, the Nebraskans who are in the top 20% of our income distribution have an average income of about $1.7 million on an annual basis, while the bottom 20% has an average income of about $17,000 per year. So you can see there's quite a discrepancy there between incomes and then also in the amount of tax cut that each of those respective groups would receive under this proposal.
Okay, let's talk about the corporate cut.
Sure. If you could advance the slide, please.
Yeah.
So with the corporate cut, it's largely, the same, largely the same thing as the personal income tax cut. It's really just on somewhat of a smaller scale, and that's just because our corporate tax in Nebraska is a smaller piece of Nebraska's revenue stream, but that is not to say that it is any less important. The top 1% here on this graph you see would receive an annual cut of about $1,400, whereas the bottom 20%, again, average income in the bottom 20% is $17,000 per year, would see no benefit on average, according to our analysis.
Okay. What's some of the rationale behind cutting this top rate, both for personal and for corporate?
Sure. So I think there are a few reasons why, tax cuts have been in the forefront these last few years. I will note very quickly that we have spent the last 3 years, really since the pandemic began, ratcheting down taxes in this state, almost solely at the top of the income distribution. I think the first major reason is we have this funding. We have these extraordinary, fiscal circumstances that, again, we've never seen anything like this before in Nebraska. We're not alone in this, but we have significant amounts of surplus dollars. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think, we've got some competition from our neighbors in Iowa who recently, started out on a path to really reduce their corporate income tax their personal income tax, and flatten that out, which, has consequences for the progressivity of the income tax code. I think part of that competition factor too is, some policymakers believe that Nebraska needs to be, more competitive, if you will, when it comes to our tax rates. I will just note very quickly that the evidence and most of the research points to that tax cuts and tax rates really have a minimal, if any, effect on bringing people into the state or people leaving, for that matter too, and people leave the state for other reasons largely than taxes.
Okay. Thanks, Craig. I think it's helpful because I think if you're not following this tax debate all that closely, then maybe there's questions about sort of what is this rationale for just focusing on taking the top rate down. And certainly there's been a lot of amongst the proponents of the bill, there's discussions about business competitiveness and what's happening in Iowa, as well as the fact that there's just a lot of money available. And meanwhile, the majority of the corporate tax cut doesn't even stay in Nebraska, right?
Yes, that's correct. Our estimates are that upwards of 80% of the corporate tax cut, the benefits that are realized by a corporate tax cut will flow to out-of-state corporate shareholders who tend to be, disproportionately wealthy compared to the rest of the population.
Okay. So corporate personal cuts, something about Social Security as well. Can you talk us through that?
Sure. So there is a proposal in the current legislature that would speed up a full exemption of Social Security, which simply means that the state will not tax Social Security benefits after next year if this bill passes. If the bill doesn't pass, it would be 2025 is when the state would not tax Social Security benefits. So this current proposal simply speeds it up a year. I think what's maybe important to think about when we talk about the Social Security cut is that, the fiscal note for the current proposal doesn't look like it's all that much money. But it's really important to keep in mind that when we fully exempt Social Security from state income tax, it's roughly about $170 million in current dollars that we are cutting off of the table, that we're taking out of our state revenue streams. And with Nebraska's population trends, our demographic trends, which signal that our population is aging, particularly relative to number of young people coming into the workforce, that cost is going to only continue to grow over time. And then, as with these tax cuts, predominantly high income seniors will benefit from the full exemption of Social Security income. Okay.
Let's move on to property tax proposals, because property tax has been regularly debated in the legislature. And I know there's a number of proposals on the table this year.
Sure. And I did forget to have you advance the slide. So if you could do that, please, just one.
Yep.
So I think the biggest thing to talk about with the property tax credits as they are proposed is that the governor is proposing to eliminate community colleges' ability to levy property taxes. So this would mean that the state would need to assume the portion of the community colleges budgets which are generated from those property taxes, somewhere around $275 million a year is what the state would be assuming if this proposal does in fact go through. I would say, again, this is spending through the tax code, as it will reduce the general fund dollars that we have available for other services. Really quickly on a couple of our other, longstanding property tax programs that we have that attempt to, reduce property tax bills for folks in the state. The governor is also calling for some additional increases to the property tax credit cash fund. Total amount of credits proposed over the next biennium is about $750 million. And that is on top of our other big property tax credit, which is going to cost at least $1.1 billion over the next 2 years. So you can see that these property taxes begin to comprise significant portions of the budget.
Okay. Those are some really big dollar numbers, which is sort of not on par with some of the numbers the legislatures had to work with in the past. So how can we afford to pay for all of this?
That's a great question. So, the governor's budget proposal, really banks on spending that general fund surplus that we've been talking about, that $1.9 billion that we came into session with. And another thing that we will get into here in a bit is that the governor is proposing that we spend some money from the cash reserve fund for a couple of priorities. So we're really, these proposals really leverage our current financial situation to enact permanent tax cuts and permanent structural changes to our revenue streams.
Okay. So we're relying on projections looking into the future to make some major spending commitments now and to enact some reforms to our tax code.
Yes, I think that's a fair way to characterize it. I would say that, this is how the budget process works, right? We have revenue projections on which we base our projected spending. Revenues are monitored throughout, of course, each budget cycle, and spending is adjusted accordingly. However, we've never had a financial situation like we are currently in right now. So the initiatives that are being proposed are big, and they are expensive, and they are a pretty, drastic shift, I would say, from our current status quo. And again, banking on temporary funds, which largely comprise our current financial situation, to enact permanent legislation that is going to reduce the state's ability to collect revenue and fund those services in the future, is inherently risky, we believe.
Okay. So I've been asked this question a fair amount in the past 6 weeks or so. Is this sustainable?
Yes, I've been asked that question too. So
the answer is not yes. It's an important question to ask.
It is absolutely an important question. And I would say, at this point, it's somewhat unclear whether it's sustainable, but it's obviously the most concerning thing to us is whether these proposals are sustainable. So again, the governor is proposing to spend down the surplus. And a big part of that is that the budget banks on continuing revenue growth into the future that will help balance the state's budget, right? Whether that continuing revenue growth actually occurs is yet to be seen. Historically, revenues fluctuate, fairly significantly from year to year. They're up, they're down, just depending on the economy. Revenue cycles, a number of different factors go into determining that. This budget proposal by the governor in particular banks on our revenues continuing to rise really beyond that significant bump that we got during the pandemic. Whether that growth is going to continue is unclear. We are coming off of 2 years of record revenue growth. But again, the underlying factor in that is the pandemic and the federal funds that we received. I would close my comments with this. If revenues do not continue to increase and follow current assumptions that are utilized for this budget proposal, it's certainly wouldn't be good if all of this legislation is enacted and our revenues do in fact drop.
Okay, so we're sort of banking on kind of growing our into this proposal, sort of top line.
Yes.
But then
absolutely.
I guess so then there's a question of what happens if it's not sustainable.
Sure. So if the tax cuts are passed along with our other revenue reducing measures that are being debated right now, like the K-12 proposal, the state would not be in a good place. We have spending commitments on very important services, healthcare, education, public safety, that need to be maintained. And if we are reducing the state's ability to collect revenue, those priorities are going to continue to require funding each year. And if the state doesn't have the revenue to pay for it, then that's where things begin to get dicey.
Okay. So we spent a lot of time on the governor's proposal, and the priorities laid out there, but there's a almost record number of bills that were introduced this year. So presumably other senators have other priorities as well, and some other ways about how to utilize the surplus and sort of manage our revenue systems. So let's talk about what other priorities we see.
Sure. So as you just said, there are a lot of other priorities out there, important priorities that would require funding. And, a lot of these senators introduced these bills knowing that they would require funding based on, the fact that we were coming in with a record almost $2 billion of general fund surplus, along with a robust cash reserve. I think one of the things that we need to look at as we look at all these proposals that again would require a significant amount of funding if they were in fact passed by the legislature, is that the governor's budget does not leave much money for the floor. In fact, it leaves about $220 million of what we came into session with for legislative priorities outside of those in his budget. The committee preliminary budget proposes, as of right now, to leave a little bit more money on the floor for those other priorities, about $465 million. But I would note again that the committee preliminary report does not include any tax cuts as of right now, which, depending on what is negotiated and depending on what they include in their budget proposal, is likely to reduce that number for what's available for the floor. Just a couple other things to note quickly. If that $220 million that the governor is proposing to leave for other legislation in this upcoming biennium is spent by the body, as of right now, of course, we're talking years into the future, so many things can happen, but as of right now, if that $220 million is spent, then the out years go into a deficit, which is not a good thing. And then I would also note, just very briefly, that in the following biennium, so 2 years beyond the next budget cycle, the governor's budget is already showing that there's not structural balance between our revenues and expenditures. And effectively what that means is that again, as of right now, those years are showing that we are spending more money than we are taking in, which is generally not a good sign when we're looking toward long-term sustainability.
Okay. What other things should we know about what's in the budget proposals? These are large, dense documents.
Very dense. There's a lot of other things in there, though, again, that are important factors. So one of the big things I would say is that there's room for significant state employee salary increases, anywhere from 10 to 27% based on the varying agencies. There are some provider rates included in the committee preliminary budget report. For example, development of disability and child welfare providers would get an increase under this preliminary report. For child welfare specifically, the prelim report continues the provider rate increases last year that were funded using American Rescue Plan dollars. It shifts those to the general fund, which we are happy to see. That was certainly something we were concerned about last year, funding what are very likely ongoing expenses with one-time funds. And in fact, increases those child welfare provider rates a bit, amounting to about a 7.5% increase. We anticipate potentially hearing or seeing some more provider rate increases after agency hearings. So we'll have to, wait for the final budget report to see if the committee decides to include other provider rate increases. A couple other things that I think are probably important to touch on. So Nebraska's federal Medicaid reimbursement FMAP is increasing over the next couple years, which does result in some general fund savings in Medicaid, Children's Health Insurance Program, developmental disability, as well as child welfare. I will note, though, that this Medicaid reimbursement increase is relative to our current or just the state's baseline FMAP, not the enhanced FMAP that we were receiving under the pandemic, which, as I understand it, is expiring here shortly when the public health emergency expires itself, which is seemingly going to present some issues that the Department of Health and Human Services is going to have to deal with those folks. TIOSA, or our state's K through 12 funding formula, experiences a relatively significant decrease actually in state general fund dollars. This is largely it's due to the formula, right? And it's mostly because equalized districts in the state are experiencing very strong valuation growth. And then the final thing I would say is that the governor had proposed a 2% increase in general fund dollars for the university. The committee, at least as of right now, has not included any increase, general fund increase for the university in their preliminary report, but we do expect movement on this after the university's budget hearing.
Okay, and then as you noted previously, we're not seeing a structural balance in the following biennium, which sort of raises some sort of sustainability questions.
Absolutely.
About these proposals going forwards. All right, we've got one more area to touch on, which is our cash reserve. So Craig, I'm gonna ask you to shift into that next, but for those of you who are on the line with us, please, if you do have questions, start sending them in, because once we wrap up with the cash reserve, it will be time to get into your questions. So let's talk about cash reserve, Craig.
Sure. So we currently have a record balance in our reserve fund. Again, it's like our state savings account. We've got about $1.7 billion in it right now. We're also projected to add more than $600 million at the end of this year. The governor, as well as the committee preliminary budget proposal, proposed to leave about $1.6 billion in the fund. And namely the items that both the committee proposes as well as the governor would like to see funded from the cash reserve fund are $100 million for the new prison or the new state penitentiary, and then $575 million for the Perkins County Canal project. You know, at OpenSky, we continue to believe that a balance closer to this $1.6 billion or so that both budget proposals as of right now would leave in the fund is definitely warranted. And we're happy to see that because, again, we have concerns about the sustainability of all these proposals moving forward. And the cash reserve is really a way that the state can ensure that services, you know, aren't hurt in years when revenues don't come in as expected. But I would just have one quick caveat that, you know, for example, we would like to see sentencing reform tied to any new prison that is built. And we continue to question whether $575 million worth of taxpayer dollars is for a canal is the best use of funds at this point.
Okay. Thanks so much, Craig. So I think that wraps it up with the content that we'd prepared. We've gone through a fair amount and in with the number of technical terms involved. So now it's time for you to so get your questions in, and Hannah is here to help us respond to these specific questions. So Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. The first one is, what is the average leftover percentage beyond the governor's proposal? So what's what's normal to be left over?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact percentage of what's normal. I will say that in recent years, you know, really up to the last decade or so, we have not had much money, if any, left for the floor. It's been pretty lean budget years. Last year, we had about $450 million left on the floor, which was, roughly 10% of our general fund expenditures at that time. This 200 million would be about 5% roughly of those general fund expenditures. So it's certainly less than we have seen, in recent years. But again, we've had some pretty lean budget years over the last decade or so.
Yeah. So in other years, having $220 million roughly would be a really generous amount of dollars to think about how to program. But I think in the context of this year, it's proportionally like much smaller than what's available, particularly at a time when a number of senators have put forward proposals about how to use that budget surplus.
Okay, great. We have one more right now. I think this is a little bit more of an opinion, but what do you think the governor's rationale for not cutting taxes for lower income folks? Just trying to wrap my head around it.
Would you like to take that one, Rebecca? Or
Yeah, I can try to take that one. I think we tried to touch on this a little bit earlier, where much of the rationale I think has to do with trying to make the Nebraska economy competitive and attractive to businesses. So a concern that a concern's been expressed that a number of our neighboring states have top income rates that at this point in time are lower or are being phased in to be lower than where Nebraska is at. And so a concern that if Nebraska's top rate continues to be higher than neighboring states, then it looks like we're a high tax state. I think on the OpenSky's perspective is that when you look at sort of the three-legged stool around the sort of balance of all of the different types of taxes that are collected in Nebraska, collectively, we are not a high tax state. So to focus in on one particular number, sort of in the top rate for income taxes kind of misses the overall context of our tax code. But certainly a concern about being competitive is something that has been expressed. Craig, anything to add on top of that?
No, I think that's a good encapsulation. Yeah.
So I think OpenSky's perspective is that there actually are a number of other proposals that policymakers could consider to think about, that if they wanted to use some of this budget surplus for tax cuts, there are other mechanisms that would be available to policymakers to target some of those tax cuts to reach low and middle income Nebraskans, without necessarily sort of changing structurally the tax brackets that we have. There are potentially a few different tax credits that could be available to policymakers, and certainly also the proposal of providing a rebate to taxpayers is something that has been done in other states when they have found a large budget surplus and have wanted to direct that money back to taxpayers. It's basically just write them a check. And proposals like that have been introduced in the Nebraska legislature this year. Some of them have had hearings, and I think some of them have not had hearings yet. But those are all tools that would be available to the Revenue Committee and to the legislature overall.
Okay, great. Those are the only questions we had right now. So thank you both so much for being here. And like I said, this was recorded, so this will be sent out to all of the people who registered and then put on our YouTube channel in the next 24 hours or so. So we'll get that email out. And as always, we appreciate your expertise and thank you so much.
Oh, we're so happy to do this. Thank you so much for the invitation. We appreciate all of you joining us on a holiday, and hope that you'll share the recording with your colleagues. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.